Just so you know, I am officially pleasant. It says on a referral letter from a consultant to my GP, "Thank you for referring this pleasant 35-year-old lady." I'm not sure what got the bigger laugh, the 35 or the pleasant bit. So the reading is taken from Exodus 20, starting to read at verse 1. "And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing love to the 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in the 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land of the Lord your God, in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbour's house. You shall not covet your neighbour's wife or his manservant or maidservant, his ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbour. When the people saw the thunder and the lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
So let's start with a prayer. Father, open our ears this morning to hear what you want to say to us, each of us individually. In Jesus' name, amen. So, I'm going to put you on the spot, probably more than once. But I'll start now. I want you to raise your hand if you've ever broken any of the 10 Commandments. Right, thank you. I'm not going to ask you for details, don't worry. I'm not mean enough to put you through the agony of being put on the spot and asking you which one you broke, or indeed, which ones you broke. Let's face it, this is possibly the most well-known part of the Bible. Almost everyone has heard of the 10 Commandments, even if they don't know what they are. And as we shall see, God gave these to the Israelites to help them to live the right way, which made me ask myself, if I were to write my own 10 Commandments, what would I put in? Alison's already spotted one that God missed. Thou shalt not slap thy husband. I had a look, I studied it very, very carefully, and I cannot see how any of the Ten Commandments actually apply. And yet I can't imagine that lots of those Israelites coming all day long to Moses weren't saying, "He ate me," or "She ate me." Here's your chance. What would you put in your Ten Commandments? Anybody? Thou shalt be kind. Excellent. Thou shalt do what thy wife says. Not so sure about that one. Yeah, a vote would be a good idea, Trev. Yes, we may be outnumbered. Any more? Of course we all do what our wives tell us, Peter, yes. Go on, Kathy, you had about 15 this morning earlier.
Well, there's loads of things, isn't there? I said, thou shalt always take quiche to a bring and share.
Yeah, quiche to a bring and share, or anything else that...
Thou shalt have comfortable chairs in church.
What's wrong with the pews? They're fine.
Good fireworks.
Thank you. Because I wondered, would they be similar to the original 10? And clearly they wouldn't. Would I try to make them more relevant to today's Western society? Clearly we would. But I have to admit that my first thought was much more simple and straightforward than you lot. My first thought was that if it was me, I'd just cut it down to one much more simple commandment which was much easier to obey. Thou shalt do thy best. I reckon that covers it. But I'm not God. And this is perhaps evidence that the Ten Commandments are actually from God, because they're not quite that simple and straightforward and easy. I think I'd lose the essence of what God was teaching his people then and still today. So going back to last week, Matt gave us the context to this passage, and I think it's worth going back over that to remind ourselves about it. The reason why God gave the Israelites the Ten Commandments. Moses had got himself into a position where, personally for him, it just could not go on. He'd be burning out. From morning till night, he was doing nothing but sorting out the people's disputes. Clearly, they were a rather argumentative bunch of people, these Israelites. Nothing like us, of course. We've seen already that it didn't take long from the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea, deliverance from slavery in Egypt, before the people were complaining to Moses, "What you brought us out to this desert for? Nothing to eat. Blah, de blah, de blah, de blah, de blah." And right the way up to today's reading, there's no way Moses could carry on like this. It was destroying his family life, to the point where he'd sent his wife and children back to her dad because he got no time to look after them. Jethro, being the sensible bloke that he was, went straight back to Moses to find out what was wrong. Didn't take him long to spot it. And his advice was twofold. Number one, teach the people how God wanted them to live. And number two, appoint capable, godly men to judge the disputes. Just referring the difficult cases to Moses. Unfortunately, Moses had the sense to listen to Jethro's advice. But I have to say, I do wonder why Moses hadn't cottoned onto this already. Really, he must have been a bit dim from time to time. The assistants he appointed straight away. They'd already got elders, so I think what he must have done was given them more authority. And I think God agreed wholeheartedly with Jethro, which brings us to the Ten Commandments, because I think God was probably just as sick as Moses of the Israelites' constant whinging. And God intended the Israelites to know exactly how serious all this was. So he staged something of a dramatic event. We've got God coming down to the mountain. We've got thick smoke. We've got trumpets. We've got the mountain being cordoned off. Break the cordon and go onto the mountain, death. The people were under instruction to shoot them with arrows or throw stones to kill them. Prior to that, 3 days to consecrate yourselves. Get yourselves ready. By the time we come to the event, they must have been absolutely petrified. I certainly would have been. God intended that this would be a day they would never forget. A day that would still be spoken of thousands of years in the future. And here I am, the latest in the line. We need to put ourselves in their shoes to understand what's going on here. Until now, God had spoken to the people through Moses. Before that, they were in slavery in Israel. Before that, God had spoken to them through Abraham. They'd been used to a leader who they could look up to, someone who would speak to God for them and tell them what he'd said. And it made me think we've come a very long way from the Garden of Eden, where God walked and talked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening, talking with them as friends at the end of the day. It's very different now, where the people are actually saying, don't let God talk to us. They were so afraid of him. And it's not really surprising, is it? Because they'd spent so long living in Egypt. And in Egypt, there were lots of different gods, where the pharaohs were regarded as gods as well. And not only had they become slaves in Egypt, but they'd been praying to God to save them literally for decades. It's a point I made a couple of weeks ago. So long that they thought he'd deserted them completely. And as far as we know, they didn't have a leader during that time. So it's perhaps not surprising that they drifted away from God. It's not surprising that they were confused about their faith. But now God's spoken powerfully, very powerfully. I've already described the drama of this scene, but before that, there were the plagues in Egypt. There was the crossing of the Red Sea, led by a pillar of fire and smoke. There was the provision of manna in the desert for them to eat. So here we are at Mount Sinai. So I think it's time to look at what God said. Starting by reminding them, if they needed reminding by now, and I think they probably did, that their God was speaking to them. And it was he who had brought them out of slavery in Egypt. It's intensely personal. I am your God. He states their relationship right at the start. Before he gives any commandments at all, he states their relationship clearly. Because maybe They'd forgotten about that relationship. And the first commandment reinforces that. You shall have no other gods but me. Now, it's easy for us to forget how revolutionary this was at the time. Because at that time, everybody followed a multitude of gods. This is the first time, I think I'm correct in saying, the first time in history where we find a faith with one God. It's very different for us today. The three main religions on earth together all have one God between them, and they account for over half the world's population. Very, very different to how it was when this reading was happening. But it's still something we struggle with. How often do we put something else before God? We may not call that something a God. We may not think we worship it, but nonetheless, very often, our priorities are not always as they should be. I always think about this when we sing Be Thou My Vision, especially where we sing about God being first in my heart, because it always makes me ask, is he first in my heart? Always? So when it comes to breaking the Ten Commandments, I think I often fall at the first hurdle. And the next three also refer to our relationship with God. Now, these days, mostly we don't make idols of wood or metal in our society. But over the centuries, that has been common practice, and it still is in many parts of the world today. A trip to India and Southeast Asia will show you that. But misusing God's name is certainly commonplace in our country. And again, I'm not immune. And I wonder why this is so important. I think, well, if we worship God, if we truly honour him above all, his name will be precious to us. We use his name in prayer when we're talking to him. So we should be careful not to use that name carelessly when we're angry or frustrated, because that's the time when I'm tempted to misuse God's name. This is all about us holding God in his proper position in our relationship. Because again, this is all about our relationship with God. And keeping the Sabbath, it's almost impossible in our modern society, but this is actually about two things. It's about making time to be with God and not falling into the trap that Moses fell into of not getting enough rest. And I even wonder whether that commandment was almost specifically written for Moses. Come on, Moses, take a day off, mate. But also for the Israelites, let Moses have a day off, all right? But there's still that temptation for us in our busy modern society to work, and more work. But this is why it's important to be in church, to worship him together, to hear his word, to remind ourselves what we believe, to speak with him together in prayer, for it to be the focus of our week when we meet specifically to spend time with our God. Life's hard enough without trying to do it all on our own. We need him to help us keep it all in perspective and to give us strength to live to our best. And then the other 6 commandments are all about our relationship with each other. The very reason why the Israelites needed this teaching in the first place, because they were constantly at odds with each other for one reason or another. If they could live according to those 6 commandments, Moses' life would be so much easier, wouldn't it? I think it says a lot about them that these things needed to be stated so clearly. Things that I think largely seem fairly obvious for a society to live in harmony together. I mean, come on, thou shalt not kill each other. It's fairly obvious, isn't it? So we start with honouring your parents. And I think this is about, well done, Ollie. I think this is all about social cohesion. It's the glue that binds a society together, because this teaches us to look beyond ourselves and to think of someone else's needs ahead of our own. It's a template for our relationship with God. In a nutshell, I think this commandment is all about family. And the rest are really very similar to each other. Basically, be content with what you've got and don't poke your nose into other people's business. And the range is so wide, everyone will have broken at least one. I doubt if any of us have committed murder, I hope. But can any of us honestly say that we have never in our lives taken something that didn't belong to us? Can we ever say that none of us have ever blamed someone else for something that we did wrong? I remember being at school. Please, sir, it was him. When I knew all along it was me. Have none of us seen someone else's house or car and thought, wish I could afford that? Maybe not so much the ox or the donkey. So apart from lightening Moses' workload, what are the 10 Commandments all about? What do they mean for us today? In summary, I think they show us our mistakes. And life, as we were talking about on Thursday night in our home group, is all about making mistakes and learning how to deal with them. It's only through getting things wrong that we learn how to be better people, hopefully. It's the way we grow and develop our characters. This is the starting point to living in community together. And this was the Israelites' problem. They didn't have a guide to tell them when they were making mistakes. And of course, Jesus summed it up perfectly when he said, we're to love God first and to love our neighbour as ourselves. So let's go out today determined to put God first and to treat each other well, even the ones we don't like. And of course, don't covet your neighbour's donkey, all right?